From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. An appearance of impropriety, says the judge in Donald Trump's Georgia election interference trial. Lead prosecutor Nathan Wade now stepping down so Fulton County DA Fani Willis can stay on the case. We'll discuss the latest with former federal prosecutor Jessica Roth. Plus, President Biden welcoming the Prime Minister of Ireland to the White House today. We'll have highlights of my conversation with former Congressman Joe Kennedy, now Special Envoy to Northern Ireland. And no endorsement from his vice president. Mike Pence says he will not be supporting former President Trump in this presidential campaign. We'll break it down with our political panel coming up. Thanks for being with us today on Balance of Power. Kaylee Lyons will be back with us on Monday, and joining us now at the table, Bloomberg's Peggy Collins, Nick Wadhams, and Dave Wilcox with our top stories. Peggy, we'll start with you. It's great to see you. Welcome back. Former Vice President Mike Pence making news a bit earlier today on Fox News when asked directly about his support for Donald Trump. Peggy, take a listen to what he said.
We have not heard from you. Will you be endorsing your former president? You were on the ticket with him last time around.
Well, Martha, I appreciate the question. And it should come as no surprise that I will not be endorsing Donald Trump this year.
Peggy Collins, it wouldn't be news if it weren't a bit of a surprise. What do you make of this?
Well, I think two things. As he's indicating, he thinks it's not a surprise, and part of that is because of what happened on January 6th. Of course, yeah. And also, as Vice President Pence was on the campaign trail, he had different visions for the future of this country than Trump. I think that's the key thing here, Joe, is that we are seeing someone who's saying the future of the Republican Party is changing. And I think there are a number of people like Vice President Pence, potentially Ambassador Haley, who are thinking that if Trump doesn't win in November, then the Republican Party needs to go back to the Reagan-type era of conservatism. If Trump does win in November, it will be a sign that the Republican Party has firmly shifted to his and the MAGA views of where the party should go.
Well, you do wonder if that's already happened. But it's smart. You point out Nikki Haley. She did not endorse anyone when she decided to suspend her campaign. And when you step back a little bit here, because they have something in common, they both worked for Donald Trump. When you look at the team that he assembled and the team that evolved over the course of his presidency, none of them are supporting Donald Trump in his reelection, are they?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. We are still early now, and we've seen in the past that there are certain people who, you know, at the time weren't quick to jump in with Donald Trump, but as he gets closer to potentially regaining the White House, may decide that it behooves them either in terms of influence or actual cabinet positions that they're going to jump in. I mean, we did see Mitch McConnell endorse him recently.
That is true. When you think about the General Millies, though, the Rex Tillersons, the Mick Mulvaney's, none of them are in the MAGA camp in this campaign, and it's striking to hear the vice president now, the former vice president, say that. It was a big day for Donald Trump, by the way. The Georgia case, we understand Fani Willis will stay on the case at the expense of her lead prosecutor, who she had a romantic relationship with. We're also waiting potentially for what appears to be an inevitable delay in the Bragg case in New York, the hush money case that was supposed to start at the end of this month. Peggy, a new dump of documents this week means it will likely be delayed.
I think two things come out of the advancements this week in those cases, which is, one, on the Fani Willis case today, it is a setback for Donald Trump. The bulk of that case is going to go forward, and that's one of the most sprawling cases, and also one at the state level that Trump couldn't pardon himself of if he gets the White House again in November. I think the other key takeaway here from this week is that all of the Trump criminal cases are slowing down. So it remains to be seen if any of them are decided by the November election. Yeah,
the strategy delay appears to be working for him at this point. Peggy Collins, thank you so much for getting us started today. Elsewhere, Israel's war cabinet approving an assault plan For the Gazan city of Rafah, after civilians have first been moved out, an indication that authorities are prepared to step up their military campaign against Hamas, with ceasefire talks now ongoing. For more, we bring in Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who runs our national security team here in Washington. Nick, this is an important moment. There is a plan, but it's not imminent, we're told. It would still have to be approved. What do you know about the details?
Well, the issue is we don't really know anything about the details. Secretary of State Blinken said today in Vienna, we have not seen the plan, and we really need to see a plan.
Wow.
So this is forcing another issue that's going to has been a big problem for the Biden administration, which is they have pledged so much support for the Netanyahu government. Increasingly, as this war has gone on, they've had more and more concern about the way that Israel is conducting the war. And now we really come to the crux, because there are more than 1 million Palestinians in Rafah. And the U.S. is saying, you have got to get those people out of there before your military forces go in. And Israel is so far saying, hey, trust us, we got it figured out. Of course, you can't just get those people out. You've got to put them someplace where they have food, water, shelter. And so far, the U.S. is saying, we have absolutely no idea how you're going to do this, and you need to tell us quickly before you go ahead. Very unclear how that's going to be resolved.
Well, trust appears to be diminishing among Democrats here in Washington. The speech by Chuck Schumer on the floor of the Senate yesterday, calling for a new election. Reaction today from President Joe Biden. And he was asked about what Chuck Schumer had to say. Here's how he responded.
Senator Schumer contacted my staff, my senior staff. He's going to make that speech. And I'm not going to elaborate on the speech. He made a good speech, and I think he expressed a serious concern, shared not only by him, but by many Americans.
You're surprised to hear essentially an endorsement from the commander-in-chief?
You know, it's very difficult to tell what exactly the president means there when he, there could be a lot riding on the idea of him saying it's a good speech. I mean,
sure.
In some ways this does serve the administration's interest, because it means that they have other people who are putting the pressure on Netanyahu. I mean, there is only so much that President Biden wants to say publicly. Obviously, as far as we're being told, those messages really are being delivered through back channels. But given his public embrace of Netanyahu early on in the war and continuing to supply military aid, ammunition and things like that, to turn around now and then say, to tell him to step aside. I mean, the president does not want to be seen interfering in another country's elections. So that's a real no-go zone for him.
Fascinating. Just quickly, he's meeting, of course, his green tie reminds us with the Taoiseach today. The Irish Prime Minister is in town, and we understand the Prime Minister got quite an earful with 4,000 comments from his voters urging him in some cases not to come to the U.S., but to also take a stand on our policy in Israel and Gaza. Did the president get an earful from him today?
Well, we're still trying to figure out what exactly was said in that, because obviously it's not in President Biden's interest to say that he got an earful from the prime minister. But what this does, again, is show actually to some degree how much of a benefit it was for President Biden to have Chuck Schumer give that speech, because it shows, listen, I am paying attention, I hear these voices, and we are taking them into consideration. The question is, okay, what now? There are a lot of senators who are calling for conditions on military aid to Israel. The administration has not been willing to go that far. But they are happy to have these voices out there, especially from folks like Chuck Schumer, because it shows he's listening, he's paying attention, he's thinking about what to do next. I mean, what's clear is this is not really sustainable for the Biden administration if Israel does not come up with that plan for Rafah.
This is clearly an important moment. Nick, thank you for walking us through it. Nick Wadhams from our Washington bureau here at Bloomberg. The state of the economy also front and center for many American voters, of course, and next week a rate decision, I should say, and important news conference from Fed Chair Jay Powell could provide some clues about the central bank's next move. And we want to get to this by way of politics with David Wilcox of Bloomberg Economics. David, it's great to see you. You've been writing about this on the terminal, about the extent to which politics might play into the Fed's plan for the year ahead. A lot of people assume that Jay Powell is going to be listening to Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and your research has found exactly the opposite.
It's true. Every time during a presidential election year, the Fed comes under suspicion from all sides that it's going to rig the dice in terms of its rate-setting decisions. Politicians on both sides of the aisle are anxious that the Fed will act to advance the interest of the other party. Investors assume that the Fed will sit still in order to try to stay out of the partisan crossfire. I took a close look at the statistical evidence and concluded that, as best as I could tell, for the past 3 decades, there's no evidence to support those fears.
3 decades of data to put forth here. It's really pretty remarkable because that suspicion is alive in the markets and in Washington. You're going to be disappointing Donald Trump here. He tended to be just a tweet away from talking to Jay Powell. With your expertise on this, though, David, give us a sense of what we're looking for next week. We've had some tough economic data for this administration to the point where people are doubting that rate cuts will come anytime soon.
I think it's clear the Fed's going to postpone its rate cut decision until later in the year. The baseline expectation of my colleagues in Bloomberg Economics is the first rate cut will come in May. There's some risk with strong inflation data, activity continuing to be well sustained, that may get pushed back to June. But we're still expecting 2 or 3 rate cuts over the course of this year. The situation is normalizing, getting better. Inflation will come down toward the Fed's 2% objective, and that'll provide the backdrop the Fed needs to take that first step in the cutting cycle.
Yeah, fascinating. A new Bloomberg News survey of economists, 49 of them finds expectations of 3 rate cuts this year and 4 next. We'll see what next week tells us. Our thanks to David Wilcox of Bloomberg Economics. Coming up on Balance of Power, 3 big developments in the Donald Trump legal world in just the past 24 hours. We'll go through it with former federal prosecutor Jessica Roth. Will there be any trial before the election? That remains a question. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
He found a way to do some legal jujitsu by saying, well, because of an appearance of impropriety, you gotta drop either Nathan Wade or yourself. So it's gonna be bye Felicia to Nathan Wade.
That was Dave Ehrenberg, Palm Beach County State's attorney, earlier today on the early edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio, reacting to the judge's decision today in Georgia to allow Fani Willis to stay on in the Georgia election interference case against Donald Trump. But of course, only if, and as we've now learned, this will happen, the special prosecutor she appointed and was romantically involved with stepped down from the case. I'm now joined by former federal prosecutor with the Southern District of New York State, Jessica Roth. It's great to see you, Jessica. Did the judge make the appropriate decision in this case? He didn't go very easy on Fani Willis in his ruling.
So he reached an opinion that I think is well reasoned. He said basically there is no actual conflict of interest here. He does not find that Fani Willis was financially benefiting from her appointment of Nathan Wade. What he said is that notwithstanding the fact that he did not find sufficient evidence of an actual conflict of interest, he was concerned about the appearance of a conflict of interest, and that the public watching these proceedings as they unfolded would be worried about there being a conflict of interest if, notwithstanding what the evidence established in court about the relationship being over between Nathan Wade and Fani Willis, that the public watching might think, well, what if it restarts? And what if, in fact, there is some financial benefit that she realizes in some way, shape, or form from continued travel with him? And if the reimbursements are not split 50-50, for example. So he is basically saying, I'm concerned about the public's perception of the legitimacy of this proceeding, which is extraordinarily important as it goes forward. And for that reason, he said, we can't have both of these individuals involved in the prosecution team. I'm giving you the choice. One of you is going to leave the team. And I think appropriately, Nathan Wade then stepped down.
Well, I'll tell you what, Judge McAfee, as I said, didn't go very easy on her. He refers to her unprofessional manner as a witness at the hearing in which she described her relationship and then went on to describe an odor of mendacity that remains. Why would this person be kept in front of a trial if that's the case?
The language that you're citing is really extraordinary in this opinion. I mean, I can't think of another time that I've seen a prosecutor described in such terms. So it's if I were Fani Willis.
An odor of mendacity means that she lied, doesn't it?
I'm not sure exactly what he means by that phrase, to be perfectly honest, but it's not good. It's not good for any lawyer, and it's not good for the elected district attorney in Fulton County, who's in charge of such an extraordinarily important historic case. He did find, however, and I think it is important, that he did not see any way in which Donald Trump or any of the other defendants in this case had been prejudiced in terms of the fairness of the proceedings. He didn't think that their due process rights had been in any way violated. So he did take pains to point that out. That's why he didn't dismiss the indictment as a remedy. But he clearly took Fani Willis to task in those portions of the opinion that you referred to for her unprofessional conduct as a witness on the stand, and also for her errors of judgment. We called it terrible judgment in hiring Nathan Wade and engaging in the sort of fast and loose approach to documenting how costs were split between them when she should have been aware that her behavior would be under the utmost scrutiny.
Jessica, I need you to help me understand what is happening in New York, where what appeared to be the one trial that would take place before the election now appears to be inevitably delayed after thousands of documents were delivered late by the Southern District of New York. Alvin Bragg, the DA, this is the hush money case, the Stormy Daniels case, says the new documents include materials he requested more than a year ago. I know this might get a little bit close to your resume in this case, Jessica, but is the Southern District of New York to blame here?
Well, it certainly looks like their delay in producing these documents is the only identifiable source of the present delay, the adjournment that you just alluded to. So I'm scratching my head, like many alums of the office and other observers, trying to understand what happened here. The DA's filing, he said he put some blame on Trump for having delayed in requesting documents as long as he did. And obviously, if they'd been requested earlier, there could have been follow-up earlier. But it does seem like the SDNY was late in turning these documents over, and we just don't have the explanation yet for why they held them back, whether there was some law enforcement concern about turning them over. We really don't know. And so I want to wait to evaluate the situation and we see both what is in the documents and what the explanation is, if one is proffered, for why the delay. But we really are in this extraordinary situation where that trial that we thought was going to go forward quite firmly on March 25th is at this point adjourned to the middle of April, and who knows what will happen beyond that. We're going to wait and see what information is forthcoming about those documents from the SDNY and what the reasons were for not turning it over earlier.
That is remarkable, Jessica. We've got less than a minute left. Does that mean then that we could well be in a world in which none of these trials happen before the election?
It really is extraordinary. I mean, not too long ago, we thought that Donald Trump was going to be involved in criminal trials one after the other up until Election Day, potentially. And now it really does seem like a possibility that there may be 0 trials before Election Day. We have to wait and see what the Supreme Court does with respect to the immunity question in Jack Smith's January 6th case. But at this point, it doesn't look like there's anything that's about to go forward.
Amazing. It's great to have you, Jessica. Thank you, as always, Jessica Roth, with us here on Balance of Power. Coming up, the Taoiseach at the White House today and on Capitol Hill, meeting with Joe Biden, the Irish Prime Minister, ahead of St. Patrick's Day, an annual event here in Washington. We'll have more on that, along with my conversation with Joe Kennedy, the Special Envoy to Northern Ireland. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Today celebrates 100 years. That's right. 100 years. Diplomatic relations between Ireland and America. And as far as that friendship goes, it keeps increasing, not diminishing.
President Biden meeting earlier with the Prime Minister of Ireland, the Taoiseach, ahead of St. Patrick's Day celebrations this Sunday. I had a chance to catch up yesterday with Joe Kennedy, the former congressman from Massachusetts. is now the U.S. Special Envoy for Northern Ireland, where the executive was just reinstated 6 weeks ago following a long-running boycott of Brexit by the Democratic Unionist Party there. Now that the government is back up and running in this fashion, he talked to us about the significance of this moment. Here he is.
Any administration, any president of the United States gets pulled in a number of different competing directions. I think it's probably not going to come as a surprise to anybody in this room when I say President Biden is committed to the island of Ireland. Probably not a shock with anybody, right? But he's committed to the island of Ireland, right? You have a president of the United States that made a point to visit the island, north and south, for a series of days just last year to help celebrate and recognize, yes, the historic achievement of 25 years of peace and stability brought on by a Belfast Good Friday Agreement, but to set the stage exactly where the First Minister and Deputy First Minister put it, of we can recognize and celebrate that past, but let's prepare for and celebrate and reach for that future. When I come into Belfast and head of the civil service took me up to the top of the big cranes in Samson and Goliath, and I took a panoramic selfie, which is somewhat hard to do, but we did, up on top, because I wanted a picture of that harbor, so that when I go back there in 10 years, I can take a look at what it used to look like, because it will not look that way in 10 years. Because there's just too much talent. There's too much opportunity.
Special Envoy Kennedy, the corporate tax rate's 25%. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
What does that mean internationally as we all debate things like minimum corporate taxes? It's something that we're talking about here in Washington every day.
So there's a differential, obviously, between the tax rate in Northern Ireland and the tax rate in the Republic of Ireland. Mm-hmm. We've had this conversation, Joe, I've heard this conversation about 12 times in the past 36 hours.
Forgive me.
Because it's an issue. A lower tax rate only works if you have the talent to actually perform, right? Massachusetts, our beloved town in Boston, Massachusetts isn't known for its lowest tax rate. What Massachusetts is known for is talent. And so, look, there's other issues out there that are the decision for policymakers to decide about what that appropriate tax rate should be for Northern Ireland. That's not for me to decide. That being said, what is unequivocal is that it's going to be in a world that is going to become increasingly competitive for talent. Northern Ireland's got it. And not only does it have it, you've heard from both of these gentlemen that the institutions of Queens and Ulster have been instrumental at ensuring that they will innovate, continue to innovate off of that, to continue to provide employers with employees that have the skill set that they need. Mm-hmm. And that connection is so critically important.
That was U.S. Special Envoy for Northern Ireland, Joe Kennedy, talking with us in Washington and here on Balance of Power. Coming up, the biggest challenges facing world leaders in 2024. We'll speak with Mauricio Lyrio, Brazilian envoy for the G20 next, in a conversation you'll only see here on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Kaylee Lyons will be back on Monday. As Brazil prepares to host the G20 Leaders Summit this year in Rio de Janeiro, poverty, the climate, and the stability of global financial institutions are all on the agenda, along with discord around the globe. Joining us now, Mauricio Lyrio, Brazil's envoy for the G20 and Secretary of Economic and Financial Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's great to see you, sir. Welcome to Washington, and thanks for talking with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I was listening to you speak at the Wilson Center this week. You described a moment of growing antagonism, rivalries that are reappearing, and conflicts that are springing everywhere, you said. Will this G20 bring a platform to resolve these growing issues?
Well, I would say the main task that Brazil has for G20, first is to keep dialogue afloat. Mm-hmm. We need to have a G20 which is functioning well, keeping countries discussing the important issues, and as much as possible to concentrate on those issues that Brazil considers to be the most important points and objectives of the international agenda, mm-hmm. like overcoming poverty, mm-hmm. fighting hunger, reducing inequality. So Brazil would like to see a G20 which is focused not on conflicts, but focused on the main, I would say, common objectives that we have, including sustainable development and the fight against climate change. So let's have a more positive agenda on that.
Yeah. Well, much was said at the G20 finance ministers meeting. I'm sure, as you remember, there was disagreement over how to characterize the war in Ukraine, and we were left with a communique that nobody would sign. How do you avoid a scenario like that?
Well, I think that we should see G20 in a more comprehensive way. We are going to have 120 meetings in G20, including the summit in Rio in November, 18 and 19 of November. And what we have been witnessing in all the meetings, and we have already had more than 30 meetings, is a wide convergence on the objectives that Brazil has established for G20. For example, launching a global alliance against hunger and poverty. Also, a mobilization against climate change. So I see, I would say, good prospects for advancing all those issues, because the negotiation around those issues have been advancing well.
Yeah. Well, this is a real peek behind the curtain that you're giving us. People tend to see a big family photo and they read a communique at the end of a G20. These are conversations that start months in advance with envoys like you from each country. But of course, you're hosting the G20, so you obviously have a much greater influence on the way this is going to roll out. But these are the meetings that determine the agenda that the leaders will follow. Is that right?
Yes. But let's not over-exaggerate the importance of one specific communique in a specific meeting. Because the most important communique will be the leaders' declaration at the end of the process, right? And for that purpose, the idea that we have concrete results by the summit is something that we think it's achievable, because so far Brazil has been receiving a wide support for those priorities that we established. The three of them, as I said, the question of poverty and hunger, the question of climate change, and the other question which is important, global governance, so that we can have more productive and constructive dialogue in order to achieve those objectives.
President Lula is again calling to reform the United Nations and other multinational organizations. Think the World Bank, because they are, quote, this is from your foreign minister, not equipped to deal with current challenges. As we see the paralysis in the UN Security Council, for instance, how is the G20 different in its ability to affect the global conversation?
Yes. No, these, I would say, very dire situation in which, for example, last year we had a record number of conflicts in the world, 183 among states, within states. So it is a record in 30 years. We are back to the Cold War times in terms of number of conflicts.
Yeah, how about that?
So we need a strong UN, because the UN, the United Nations, was created to preserve peace and avoid war. So the main organization to deal with that is not today managing to have its task fulfilled, because disagreements are happening. So we need to give a push to the reform. But it comes to the other question that you presented. G20 is not itself an international organization.
Right.
So it does not establish the norms, but it establishes, in a way, part of the agenda and influences a lot the agenda and the process in other organizations. So one of the objectives that Brazil has is to push for the reform of the UN with G20. That's why we are planning to do, for the first time in history, one meeting of G20 inside the headquarters of the United Nations. It will be in September 26th. So that from inside we can also give a push to the reform.
Well, so you talk about reform that's necessary in these groups. Look at what's happening in the Security Council. Russia is a big part of the problem here. And there have been suggestions that Russia should be kicked out of groups like these, should be kicked out of the G20. I don't know your thought on that. Some think that it's more effective to keep them in the fold and have a dialogue. What does Russia deserve?
Brazil wants a more inclusive Security Council, not a less inclusive Security Council, in the sense that in order to have the capacity of achieving agreements through dialogue and diplomacy, you need to have more diversity, not less diversity. So Brazil, in that sense, is supportive of a reform of the Security Council from, well, I would say since the last decades, for a long time doing that. And we think that this is the part of the reform of the UN. The UN is more than the Security Council, but the Security Council is the core in terms of preserving peace and avoiding war. And we think that a more representative Security Council would be, I would say, the instrument for it to be more effective.
What would be more representative, just to be clear?
To have, representation which is no longer a mirror of the aftermath of Second World War. That's what is the Security Council nowadays. But we are no longer in 1940s. We are into 2024, and we need to have an updated Security Council in order to deal with the challenge of today.
This will be discussed at your G20. Thank you so much for coming to see us
My
today
pleasure
in Washington. Remember this conversation when the G20 gets going in Rio in November. Mauricio Lyrio, we thank you for being with us here on Balance of Power. Coming up, Donald Trump's vice president will not be endorsing him in the presidential race. Mike Pence has made that clear today, and our political panel will discuss next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We have not heard from you. Will you be endorsing your former president? You were on the ticket with him last time around.
Well, Martha, I appreciate the question. And it should come as no surprise that I will not be endorsing Donald Trump this year.
Mike Pence, the former vice president, there speaking earlier today on Fox News. Let's assemble our political panel. It's Friday and our closers are with us. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. Happy Friday, both. Welcome to the threshold of the weekend. Rick Davis, Mike Pence, what about the pledge? I thought everyone took a pledge to get on the debate stage that they would support or endorse the candidate who got the nomination, not Mike Pence, huh?
You know, I think it's kind of rough justice, right? I mean, the only guy who didn't get on the stage was the guy that they now are supposedly forced to endorse. So, I mean, I think it's fair enough, right? I do think it's a little bit interesting in that he's not endorsing him, but he's likely to vote for him. And so I think that takes a little bit of the edge off, right?
He has said that, right? He will vote Republican.
He will vote Republican. And I think, you know, maybe that's a message to other leaders is you don't have to endorse a guy. Maybe you're going to vote for him. But I think he was concerned about, like, am I sending a signal to people that I want them to vote for Donald Trump?
Yes, right.
He's like, I make up my own mind how I'm going to vote, but I don't think other people should take that into consideration.
Yeah. Jeannie, of course, Nikki Haley didn't endorse Donald Trump either. She didn't endorse anyone when she suspended her campaign. We saw 77,000 people vote for someone other than Donald Trump in Georgia in the Republican primary last week, as we discussed. Those votes went to Nikki Haley, and I realized there was some early voting there that might have inflated that number. But what does this represent? Mike Pence making that announcement today, the sort of protest vote that we continue to see with Nikki Haley.
Yeah, I mean, it means that there is a sizable portion. It's smaller than the pro-Trump portion of the RNC, but the Republican Party, but there is a sizable portion who feels like they will not and do not want to support Donald Trump. And, you know, I think one thing we should all take away from this is that going forward, these pledges are ridiculous. You know, for the RNC to make these people pledge this to get on the stage, and then we're told, oh, I just said that, Nikki Haley said, to get on the stage. Well, gosh, maybe we just don't do these pledges anymore, these fake pledges to get on the stage. It's ridiculous. And I'm not surprised about Pence because, of course, he said anybody who puts themselves over the Constitution has no right being president. Now, I don't know. He says he's going to vote Republican. Maybe he writes in himself or somebody else.
Sure, maybe a little Ronald Reagan right in, or, you know, we saw a lot of Republicans leave that top of the ticket blank in states like Georgia, this we've discussed, Rick, so I suppose there are some options here. But Donald Trump is about to head for Ohio this weekend. I'm not sure the point necessarily. This is a foregone conclusion for the primary next week, right? But he's targeting that Rust Belt where Joe Biden is struggling and needs to try to turn things around. We have another ruling today, or at least in not just the Fani Willis ruling in Georgia, but it looks like the Alvin Bragg case in New York could be delayed. Is Donald Trump just coasting at this point to the convention?
You I don't think he's coasting in the sense that he feels like it's in the bag. I mean, I think he feels like the nomination's in the bag.
Sure it is, yeah.
I think, it's likely that he's going to Ohio to influence the outcome of the Senate primary, which is red hot. He's got an endorsement there.
Yep.
So he'd love to declare victory that, his people are being nominated by the party just like he was.
Right.
He's taken over the RNC, so he now owns it, right? So if anything goes wrong, he owns it, he broke it, right?
Yes.
So I think that's something he's learned from the past, is that these organizations that are going to be affiliated with him by virtue of his, leadership and ownership of them in that regard, could reflect poorly on him if it doesn't go well. So I think it's a more learned campaign than it was in 2016, certainly. And I think for that reason, he wants to not take anything for granted and wants to be able to win a Senate because obviously if he is elected president, he's going to want a Senate and a House to do his bidding.
Well, and they see that being a major opportunity in Ohio. Jeannie, I want to ask you about this race. I'd like to hear from both of you on it. Bernie Moreno is the businessman from Cleveland endorsed by Donald Trump. And Jeannie, we're seeing an ad buy, and it's a pretty big one, almost $900,000 by a Democratic group in this case. It's called Duty and Country, to try to elevate Bernie Moreno above the establishment Republicans, including Matt Dolan, the state senator. We've seen this repeatedly in Democratic politics. Chuck Schumer helping to put this ad out, targeting, again, his name is Bernie Moreno. Let's get a sense of what the ad is like.
MAGA Republican Bernie Moreno is too conservative for Ohio. In Washington, Moreno would do Donald Trump's bidding. That's why Trump endorsed Moreno, calling him exactly the type of MAGA fighter that we need in the United States Senate.
Well, we've seen this movie before, Jeannie. The winner here is going to face the Democrat Sherrod Brown in this campaign. This is, I guess, the Democratic playbook now, right? Elevate the MAGA candidate to enhance your chances of winning?
Yeah, and we saw this in California with Adam Schiff and Steve Garvey. We're seeing it again with Moreno. We should say that Sherrod Brown remains very popular in Ohio, and at least at this point, it looks like he would win the race, but there's still a long way to go. And certainly Democrats would rather run against Moreno than Dolan, because, of course, Dolan has been described by Moreno and others, certainly Donald Trump this weekend at the rally, as, a rhino, as, sort of Liz Cheney as a man. So, they're trying to hype that up so that they can get a candidate who they think Sherrod Brown would be able to beat in the general. It is, it's ugly, it is dirty politics, but it is politics, and nobody can be surprised by this. And I think they may be effective in this. They just got to hope that their bid pays off and Sherrod Brown does beat Moreno if he does beat Dolan. But the polls we've seen have Dolan and Moreno neck and neck at this point.
Well, yeah, this is risky business, isn't it? Is this smart politics?
I don't know how risky it is. I mean, in this case, it is a pretty close race. And when you look at the head-to-head of either one of these, Dolan or Moreno against Sherrod Brown, they both do equally poorly right now. I mean, it's early in the contest. But they're hovering around a 10-point loss in Ohio. Of course, a state that will go strong for
Is it smart,
Trump.
though? Could Sherrod Brown more easily beat a MAGA candidate here than Matt Dolan?
Well, I mean, that's the bet the Democrats are making. And this group, Duty and Country, I mean, that's just a front for Schumer's Senate Majority PAC. So everyone in the Senate side of the Democratic Party are making a bet that they can beat Moreno better than Dolan. But, those things can backfire, but their track record's pretty good. They've been playing in Republican primaries now for a couple of cycles, and they've been doing well. So sit back, wait and see what happens next week when we see what really comes out of that primary.
Yeah, we'll find out Tuesday. Coming up, Rick and Jeannie back with us here on Balance of Power as we look ahead to the big deadline looming next Friday for another government shutdown. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington alongside our panel. Rick and Jeannie are with us as Congress again Races against the clock with yet another partial government shutdown set to kick in 1 week from right now. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, is with us alongside Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. Bloomberg Politics contributors with the view here on what might happen a week from today. Jeannie, we're getting used to this. It's getting to be exhausting. Just ask any lawmaker, certainly member of the House. There's no real deal to avoid a shutdown next week. There are 6 spending bills left, and we're told that the Department of Homeland Security is a major sticking point when it comes to border policy. Are we going to finally shut down?
You know, I think we could. I hope not. It's not in anyone's interest. But at this point, what you hear about DHS, it is very, very concerning. And when I hear that Mike Johnson is in West Virginia talking about doing a laddered CR next time, but this time with 4 ladders or whatever steps, if you want to call them, I don't think my mind can compute this. I wish we would go back to 1, but that's what we're hearing. So hopefully we stay open, but I think it is going to be a struggle. And I, again, am not sure why they are not in this weekend hammering this out.
Oh, this is the comedy portion of the program, Jeannie. They'll be back next week, I'm guessing. I've been introduced to the term criminibus. CR. Rick, tell me if this is possible. You have a CR because they can't figure out what to do with DHS for just that one agency and then package the rest of them. Could that actually see the light of day?
It could. The reality is this is the kind of thing where you get to a conclusion because you're under the pressure. Okay. Last thing anybody wants to do is let the pressure off. Yeah. Because then they're right back in like the throes of this thing next week. Mm-hmm. So, or a week after that. So the reality, I think, is they'll get a deal. They already know what the top line is. It's just a policy issue. Right. You know, it's going to be something that they're going to have to just sort through. It's not hard stuff. It's not like we haven't been talking about legislative policy as it relates to the border a lot this year already, right? So the bandwidth is very narrow. And I think that in this case, the Republican majority will come to an agreement, and that'll be something the Democrats can support. Yeah. I would say, you know, what's interesting and entertaining is Johnson talking about how he's going to do it next time. I would make a bet in Vegas today that he ain't going to be the speaker the next time we have a budget vote.
I was looking forward to 4 funding deadlines a year. What do you mean? There are, of course, the phones are ringing in the Senate right now, and the lobbyists are calling about TikTok. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia talked about this here on Balance of Power yesterday and the future of this divest or ban bill that has passed the House. Here's what he said.
I absolutely would like to see it expedited. And, you know, I've started conversations with the chairman of the Commerce Committee, Senator Cantwell, and again, she doesn't need convincing. She has legislation as well on this topic. I know, you know, Senator Schumer, this all just happened yesterday, so Senator Schumer's not laid out clearly all his plans. But, I know he's raised concerns as well. So I think we need to get this done.
He thinks that they need to get it done, Jeannie, but there are a lot of concerns from both progressives and conservatives about First Amendment issues, freedom of speech, and an arbitrary 6-month deadline to force a company to act. Can this pass the Senate?
You know, I think it can. I do think if it does pass, there will be changes to it. But of course, the Senate is such an unknown because it only takes 1 senator to really hold this thing up. So I think we have to take a wait-and-see attitude on this. I have real reservations about this bill myself, but the speed and the support behind it has been tremendous, despite, to your point, all the lobbying and the calls. Some people saying the calls are coming from children who have been calling and begging for this thing to stay up.
That's true. It's not just the lobbyists, it's the content creators or whatever we call them, Rick. Block the talk, or doesn't it matter because the lawsuits will follow anyway?
Well, I do think what's interesting about what these senators are saying, both Republicans and Democrats right now publicly, is to keep the heat on TikTok to get a deal, right? Everybody agrees they don't want the CCP having influence over TikTok. And so how do you get there? And, of course, they have the same problems on Capitol Hill that Jeannie espoused about, you know, sort of creating new law around this. Right. And I think you'll see the Senate going out of its way to saber rattle on this, right, to see if they can get someone to do a deal. Former Secretary Mnuchin has already expressed a willingness to want to get into talks. If someone could put a LOI together and say, I got $100 billion and I'll buy it, then I know the Senate will tighten the screws.
Yeah, look at that.
Try to get a deal done without actually having to legislate it.
Fascinating. Where's Elon when you need him? Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Don't answer that. Great to see both of you with us here, our signature panel and our closers for the week here, with a lot more to follow next week. You're going to want to be with us a week from tonight. Keep your countdown clocks handy with a potential shutdown set for midnight Friday. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. In the meantime, stay up to speed over the weekend. Find it on the terminal and online. And we'll meet you back here on Monday alongside Kaylee Lyons. Thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. Have a great weekend. This is Bloomberg.